Hello and welcome to the 7th APWF webinar. My name is Yumiko Asayama, Manager of Japan Water Forum and also the coordinator of the Asia Pacific Water Forum. Today, we welcome Dr. Mark Smith, Director General of the IWMI, to discuss about operationalizing IWRM to build water security. Today, we will firstly deliver opening remarks from Mr. Ravi Narayanan, our APW Governing Chair. Then we will start presentation by Dr. Mark Smith. Followed by his presentation, we will deliver the Q&A. Firstly, Q&A will be delivered from our Governing Council Chair. Followed by that, we would like to have interactive discussion with audience. So I thank you so much for joining this webinar. Now I would like to invite Mr. Ravi Narayanan to deliver the opening remarks of the 7th APWF webinar. Ravi, thank you so much.
Thank you very much. And hello, everyone. Good morning and good afternoon to everybody who is joining this very, very interesting and important webinar on operationalizing integrated water resource management to build water security. And this is discussing systems of food systems, climate change, and inclusive growth. It's a complex area with many, many intersections. And so who better to discuss this and offer insights and recommendations than Dr. Mark Smith, who's the Director General of the International Water Management Institute, which is based in Sri Lanka. And it's an institution which not only believes in policy recommendations, but based on practice, not just theory and hypothesis. So it's going to be a very, very interesting discussion, and you can be sure that what Dr. Mark Smith says is going to be based on practice and actual observation, and not just on conjecture. So with that, I'm not going to say more about Dr. Smith. He's internationally well known, and if I begin to go down his CV, I'll take the whole of the session. So without further ado, may I invite Dr. Smith to take it away and bring in his presentation. Mark, over to you.
Great, thank you so much, Ravi. I hope people can see my screen. If you just can confirm that. Thank you very much. First, I'm very grateful to APWF for the invitation to give this webinar and the opportunity for IWMI to join the process in preparing for the next Asia Pacific Water Summit. Where this is very important for us. We're very grateful. When I received the invitation, the idea put to me was to look at IWRM and how it relates to other priorities around climate change, food, poverty, livelihoods, and so on. And this was really interesting to me because several years ago now, I had done some work. I'm going to touch upon this a little later. I'd done some work with some other partners on rethinking IWRM and asking the question, well, how do we revitalize what is, now a long-standing framework for how to manage water, with a view to how do we make it more practical to implement. And so I saw this webinar as a chance to revisit and perhaps restart this discussion in the context of Asia Pacific and in the context of this region's priorities and needs. So what I'm going to do is present my ideas. Present the ideas that we developed during that course of that work, and then look at those using some examples, and then I look forward to taking those ideas up in the discussion as Ravi has outlined. So in terms, therefore, of what I want to cover during these few minutes, I'll start by just framing the challenge to try and place what we're talking about in the context of Asia Pacific. A little bit of a look at IWRM, the concept. I think people are very familiar with it, but also the critique that is brought to it. And then propose some updated pillars of IWRM and illustrate those various pillars with a set of examples drawn from IWMI's own work. And then in building towards some conclusions and recommendations, try and address this question of what are the lessons then from that thinking, that work around IWRM, the experience of IWRM, lessons for the 2030 agenda, lessons for how you tackle this complexity of challenges and problems. So water security for the Asia Pacific, we have the benefit, of course, of the really excellent, I think, Asian Water Development Outlook report just recently launched at the end of 2020, in which the Asia Pacific Water Forum was a key partner. I find it a really excellent report. You know, you can be a bit cynical sometimes about these kinds of reports, these big reports, but I think this is truly an excellent one because it lays out the issues very clearly and also provides a data-driven basis for decision-making and priority setting for investments. So I highly commend, recommend the report and commend those involved in it, of which some of my IWMI colleagues were part of that work too. So as you see on the left-hand side of the slide, in the way that the AWDO report framed water security, with its different dimensions of rural households, agriculture, energy, industry, urban needs, environmental needs, the various risks around climate, hydrology, etc. There's a very clear case for indeed an integrated approach to how you build water security. So you can integrate across those various different needs, management, but also the associated investment and the associated sets of actions that are needed. And we see on the right-hand side of the slide, again taken from the report, the various ratings for different countries in the region for their national water security, and we see that situation is really very highly mixed. And that underlying that, and I think the report makes a good case for this, underlying that, of course, is a need for continuous improvement across all levels of existing current water security. And IWRM is part of the toolbox for tackling that. But what does it have to offer as we approach trying to deliver what can be, of course, complex solutions to complex problems that underlie and drive water insecurity? How can we make the best use of IWRM? And how does it need to change in order to be more effective and more impactful and more accommodating of the multiple competing challenges that there are, of course, in the world in which we are living today? Okay, so IWRM, as I say, I'm sure most people on this webinar are very familiar with the concept, and it has a history going back, formally has a history going back now, going on for 50 years, and informally has of course a much wider, a longer history in terms of indeed how we manage water, in terms of the need to bring together all the different various elements and uses. But that history started in 1977 with the Mar del Plata conference, which set out that there were these competing interests and indeed sets of trade-offs that needed to be tackled, and that led in 1992 to the adoption of the Dublin Principles for IWRM, and in 2000 a definition for IWRM, which you see I've copied into the bottom right-hand corner of the slide. And then in 2002, the decision that by global governments that they were committed to preparing IWRM, national IWRM plans and national IWRM and water efficiency plans. So that process, that history and that definition created a formalized articulation of what was meant by IWRM and a shared commitment to delivering it, to achieving it, to using it to achieve water security. And we see this is a graphic taken from the SDG synthesis report of 2018, which gives a mapping of the status of IWRM implementation in countries across the world, using an index that's rated against the elements that you see listed in the bottom left-hand corner of the map. So progress against establishing policies, laws and plans, institutions, management instruments and finance. And we're going to go through all these in a little more detail to make them clearer. But you see, in terms of implementing IWRM, and I say implementing like that because we'll be exploring what we mean by implementing. In terms of implementing IWRM, it's a very mixed picture across the world, and indeed highly mixed in the Asia-Pacific region, with really the full breadth of implementation seen across this region. So what you see now on the left-hand side of the screen is the original pillars of IWRM. So in that, as I outlined the history, we saw that it has this rooting, this basis in a formalization process, in an agreement process, and so on. And so the pillars of IWRM, as they are originally set out, are shown on the left-hand side there. And those, enabling environment of policies, a framework of policies, laws and plans, institutional aspects, using information and data and particular kinds of instruments to help make better decisions about water, and then investment. And that framing, those pillars of IWRM, in terms of how you then implement, they've come under quite a fair degree of critique over the last couple of decades, and people have seen them. Various scholars as well as practitioners and policymakers have seen them as too top-down, too focused on policies and institutions rather than implementation and action, too technocratically driven, and too normative and too idealized, which is what motivated this rethinking that myself and a set of colleagues undertook a few years ago, which, as I said, I'll touch more upon. But if you contrast that critique with ideas spearheaded by the scholar Elinor Ostrom on how adaptive governance works, and adaptive governance works around resources such as water, and this is really important work. She was awarded a Nobel Prize in economics for this work. So in that framing, adaptive governance for resources like water it works best when it's decentralized, working with self-organizing institutions. It uses rich flows of information, and different institutions at different levels and different actors are empowered to make decisions and get on with managing the resource. And that takes place through processes of dialogue and deliberation and coming together for collective action. And so there's quite a contrast then between the pillars of IWRM as they've been laid out and what other work says about how you really make change and drive change happen in the kind of complex system that water is part of. So how you really make change happen. There was a really excellent analogy drawn in a paper from, as you see at the bottom right, a paper from Bruce Langford and Nick Hepworth, and I've used this slide a great number of times, so I'm always trying to be careful to give them credit because it's a really, really helpful analogy. That the critique is that IWRM has focused too much on working in a cathedral. So this top-down, technocratic, institutionally rigid approach in perception or reality. And whereas in reality, IWRM needs to be worked on and delivered more in the setting of a bazaar, as you see on the right-hand side, where there's noise and debate and bargaining and and are coming together to try and argue about what's the best solution and how should we move forward. So there's this contrast that has driven critique and perhaps held back what can be achieved through implementation, or what we took to calling operationalizing IWRM, so making it operational. And what we were interested in is how could you, within that existing set of pillars, within that existing framework of IWRM and people's understanding of it, and indeed the way it's been adopted already into a wide range of national policies and laws and so on, how you could adopt into that elements that would introduce dynamism and debate and as Eleanor Ostrom's work demonstrated, the ingredients you need to mobilize complex systems change. So this was work that I undertook with Torkel Jons Clausen, who some people may know, a real advocate for IWRM, and he wanted to come together with a task force from the World Water Council to look at this question of how do we revitalize, how do we rethink IWRM so that it can be more effective in the 2030 agenda going forward. And that resulted in these two papers, which were essentially produced for the World Water Forums in 2015, and then the second one in 2018 in Brasilia. And the ideas that I'm talking about today, for those interested, are captured in those papers. So in terms then of those, going back to these pillars, if we look at how do we introduce into those these elements that give greater dynamism and greater focus on how things really change in complex systems. So we added a fifth and sixth pillar, as you see at the bottom of the screen in red. The first on essentially using strategies that are informed by how you really manage change, which we'll talk about. And then this idea of operating mechanisms. And again, I'll explain this further, but operating mechanisms really being what might be temporary means rather than institutional means or technocratic means, temporary means of bringing together different actors, different sectors to get on with solving a problem, but guided by a strategy within the IWRM framework. And then looking ahead to the 2030 agenda, or the relevance to the 2030 agenda, what I think is that when you bring this more practical lens to IWRM, then the various competing narratives around water management, so the water, energy, food, what can be seen as competing narratives, the water, energy, food nexus, source to sea, integrated flood management, etc. All these different frameworks that are out there for how we manage water. I think once you introduce these new, more practice-oriented elements into the IWRM framework, we start to see those competing narratives come into alignment, and I'll explain that. As well as we start to see how IWRM can more readily align with action on other critical priorities, such as climate change and food and inclusion. So how we can use our tools in water to do a better job of integrating our work into those big issues that are right now, that we know are mobilizing policy and policymakers and action and investment at increasingly huge scales that water is critical to, but perhaps is sometimes disconnected from. And so it's a means perhaps of better making those connections. As we do so, though, what I'll show you, though, is in the way we thought about it, as you do that, then IWRM becomes better positioned as a high-level framework that gives a basic architecture for those other elements, those other sets of objectives. But we'll look at that. Okay, so what I want to do now is just work through each of those pillars, as we call them, and I'll use examples from IWMI's portfolio of work, just to show, in quite a brief way, I hope, just to show what the benefits can be of working with each of these elements. So we look at it, it's a piecemeal route through the different elements of it, but we see how we build up the benefits by working with the different pieces. So the first, the pillar of the strong enabling environment, policies, laws, and institutions, we mean here the architecture of rules around which institutions are built, investments are made, and action is taken. On the screen now, you see, again, taken from the AWDO report, you see the OECD governance principles developed over the last decade or so. And those elements are really the building blocks of water governance, of the architecture of policies, laws, and plans. So we need to ask ourselves, is our enabling environment, is our water governance addressing these building blocks? And you see on the right-hand graphic a survey and assessment at regional level, sub-regional level for the Asia Pacific of where things are in good shape, in green, versus those elements of water governance of that enabling environment that are not as well advanced in the more red colors. So the example that I just wanted to quickly highlight is work that was done over the course of 2016 to 2019, I believe. That IWMI was involved in Uzbekistan, alongside a consortium of implementing partners that looked at the national policy framework for water governance and IWRM in Uzbekistan. So from this project, a set of policy packages were worked on. So you see the examples there on the screen. So amendments proposed to the key water law, formalization of coordination mechanisms, sector strategies and plans, and enabling those, and then institutional mandates refined and delineated. So putting in place that architecture, further building out that architecture, and out of that come a set of benefits, as you see listed there, bottom right. So that putting in place that architecture creates the basis for then moving forward with, for example, this multi-stakeholder platform to facilitate policy reforms, means of data exchange between states, the means of basin management plans, etc. So the second element, second pillar relates to institutions and the institutional framework. So what are the institutions that we need to deliver good management? And that provide the basis for managing basins as the unit of water management, as IWRM calls for, but then decentralization of decision making, and so therefore critically having institutions that are able to work across scales. And the example here is taken from Nepal, which I find really fascinating right at the moment, because Nepal is going through, of course, a really major change in governance with a transition to a federal system. And that's an opportunity to look, of course, at how can they put in place decentralized and inclusive policies and institutions for water management alongside within this new federalized structure with its federal level, provincial level governments, and then many local governments. So IWMI's been doing some analysis of this, as you see on the right-hand side. So analysis of needs in that policy framework, in the example shown in respect of inclusive irrigation. So yes, understanding the roles and responsibilities across those three levels of government, finding the means to articulate basin level policies which are at the federal level with the institutional cooperation that you need at the other levels, and then decentralization of irrigation development, in so doing incorporating gender and inclusion aspects in much better ways than currently is enabled, so that you have the institutional basis for then making a set of investments that can be targeted at particular needs. And what's highlighted is small-scale farmers, small-scale and women farmers. So the third pillar is around the use of data and information and tools to help with decision making. So here you see an example from IWMI's work also in Nepal, from a project called the Digojal Bikas project, which looked at building climate resilience in basins. And you had there a set of analyses, so data collection and analysis you see on the left-hand side, that enabled the preparation of a set of products, data products and models and so on, enabling integrated assessments, and then using those in water governance, using those in water governance and the decision making that was then taken. And then you see how then from analysis to products to then applications in decision making. So these were used in the irrigation master plan for Nepal, e-flows assessment, environmental flows assessment, excuse me, integrated into local government planning and climate change adaptation planning. So a key pillar there. Fourth pillar then is around investment. And here the example I want to draw from, the focus here is investment on infrastructure. And of course, we're used to talking about dams and reservoirs and water services and so on. The means of infrastructure for investment to better meet water demand, reduce water risks, help meet those food, energy security, and ecosystem needs. The example I want to show focuses on solar-powered irrigation as an infrastructure, thinking of that as infrastructure, and a project that's looking at how best to mobilize that investment across South Asia. How best to make those investments sound. There's quite an emphasis in this pillar on investments being sound. This project itself is looking at building the evidence and the capabilities that enable investment, and alongside that, demonstrations of application, and then using that to scale, to mobilize investment. And then alongside that, what are the policies and public-private partnerships that need to be brought together, and how can those best target investment at the right groups, at the right opportunities, at the right problems that need to be resolved. So you see on the right-hand side the examples that we have from Nepal of some early results from this program in relation to what subsidies are needed, the role of the private sector, the importance of making sure that those subsidies are constructed in a way that and delivered in a way that they can target inclusion, target women and small-scale farmers, etc. And the importance in doing all of that of public-private partnerships for scale. Okay, so what I'll come now to is the fifth and sixth pillars, which remember, those are the new ones. Those are the ones about making IWRM more dynamic and more operational. So here the fifth pillar then is about change management. So and what we are introducing here is dynamic processes of learning, of managing change through demonstrations, through processes of dialogue and debate, through the means of engaging action on the ground with policy formulation and policy implementation and learning processes around that, and in so doing, working adaptively on solving problems. So those elements that Eleanor Ostrom pointed towards for complex systems change. The example that you see on the screen is taken from work that was done in the Fergana Valley on IWRM in Central Asia, where you see a set of actions across the pillars that we've just looked at. So basin administration, participation, the means of water allocation, information sharing, etc. And then there's a set of results that you see on the left-hand side that emerge out of that around reorganized institutions, benefits for participation, benefits for productivity, profitability, and steps forward on transboundary cooperation. And the means to achieve those results are given in the middle. So around institutional development across a set of scales, facilitating learning and change management processes to bring people at different levels into those processes and enable them to then take action. So then the final pillar is around this idea of operating mechanisms. So what do we mean here? Here, we're focused on problems. What are the problems? What are the particular, real, tangible problems in a basin, in a location, in a watershed that need to be solved? How can we bring the actors together, bring the sectors together to work on those problems? How can we make sure that we're attracting those who are motivated to solve those problems, who have the motivation and the incentives to get on and do things, but doing that within an overall guiding strategy and overall guiding framework? The example is taken also from Uzbekistan, where the context is lift irrigation systems in which there's, as you see at the bottom left, a lot of pumping needed to get water from the river into large-scale irrigation systems, which cost a lot of energy. So on the right-hand side, the problem that the team was focused on here, the partners were focused on here, was that we have irrigation that was using a lot of water, low productivity, inefficient. Associated with that is very high energy costs, high energy use, high energy costs with impacts at national level, therefore on availability of energy for other parts of the economy, and with inefficient water use, a lot of return flows with water pollution impacting downstream health. So by bringing the different sectors and the key actors together in a problem-solving mode, the solutions were to transfer sets of energy subsidies to water-saving technologies so that you cut water use, cut energy use, raise productivity in the agricultural sector, reduce those return flows, and gain benefits for downstream pollution control and health impacts. So bring people together, bring the key actors together to solve real problems. So to move towards winding up, so we have this set of operating mechanisms with these new elements, the 5th and 6th pillars, and by working then with that full framework, with that framework for operationalizing IWRM, we integrate the points you see in the blue square. So we get the benefit of the rules of the game, bring that together with institutions that can work across scales in decentralized ways, in ways that are targeted, using data and information for more joined up decision making, making sure that investments are mobilized, but also they're mobilized in ways that are sound. So the right investment in the right place, targeting the right problems, and the right beneficiaries. And alongside that, change management that's learning, adaptive, deliberative, and appropriate for really changing complex systems, and using this idea of operating mechanisms, so problem solving guided by a strategy that enables collective action to solve problems that are real priorities. And as you, with those 6 pillars, then, as I pointed towards at the beginning, we then start to see, I think, a transition from that idea of IWRM as the cathedral to really working with the idea of it as the bazaar. So no longer such an elusive ideal, but instead an overarching guiding framework. An overarching guiding framework architecture under which you can be problem focused, mobilize different kinds of operating mechanisms according to the kinds of problems that need to be solved, as well as the different sorts of actors that are motivated to work on those problems. So then, rather than competing narratives, IWRM becomes the overarching guiding framework, basic guiding framework, and then underneath that, different means of working on problems that align to IWRM to do with the nexus, corporate water stewardship, integrated flood management, drought management, source to sea, etc. So then what are the lessons then for the 2030 agenda and the mega challenges? By the mega challenges, I mean the things that are really motivating at global level and indeed at regional level, motivating and mobilizing governments and stakeholders in the world as we're living right now, in terms of challenges related to climate, inclusion, food systems changes massively on the agenda nowadays. We hear so much more and more talk about nature-based solutions, and of course the health context is important these days too. And behind that is we know as a set of water stakeholders that water has critical contributions, and water management has critical contributions to working and creating solutions for those big challenges, because we know, and we talk often about water as being a system connector, and this is articulated in the SDGs. We all like to talk about the importance of water as interlinking across the SDGs and how important water is for all of the various goals. So it's fair to ask then, how can IWRM help? How can IWRM help with those system interlinkages? And this is where I come to this point about the relationship of the framework that I've just outlined, this expanded framework for operationalizing IWRM and the way it relates to challenges around food systems, climate, and inclusion and gender equality. So just starting with food systems, as I say, there's really a strong emerging dialogue around food systems and the transformation of food systems, and that's driven by the relationship between food and biodiversity loss, the relationship between food systems and climate change. When we talk about the food system, what they're meaning is we're linking the chain of inputs and production and transport and consumption of food and the nutritional aspects of that also with the environmental and resource impacts of all of those stages. So water is part of that story. It's an important part of that story. It's an important part of, as you see in the graphic, linking what's going on with the state of water and the state of our planet, and the health of people and the nutrition of people. And the way I like to look at it is water. We need to be managing water supply into the food systems, and that's to do with infrastructure, it's to do with nature-based solutions, it's to do with storage, etc. So managing water supply to the food system. And then, of course, water for production. So water for irrigation, agricultural water management, etc., aquaculture, and so on. And then finally, water for consumption. So drinking water supply, water for health, and so on. And all of those steps are part of what we try and tackle in IWRM. So if we have a framework for IWRM, which is very operationally oriented, the 6 pillars give us the means to align water action with the needs across the food system for water management, water supply to the food system, water for production, water for consumption. So if we can help the people working on food systems to understand the tools that we have from IWRM in those full 6 dimensions, then hopefully they can do a better job of welcoming us in to their policy space and thereby helping us to deliver also in the water policy domain, the water domain, and the food systems change domain. For climate change, it's a similar story. So the framework you see at the bottom is a framework for climate resilient water management that we published last year in a report for the Global Commission on Adaptation. And it links, as you going from left to right, it links the importance of working on governance, through working with information, through investing and taking action around nature-based solutions, around infrastructure, around different technologies. So again, looking at those 6 pillars and using those as a whole framework, we can align into the 6 pillars the actions that we need to address the different elements also of building climate resilience. So the opportunity is to take an operational IWRM framework into problem solving for climate change resilience and be able to work across all 4 of those dimensions of building resilience, which is a challenge often for those that lead on building resilience, connecting across those different dimensions, and water helps them do that. And then finally, just on the inclusion and gender equality aspect, here, if we think back to the different pillars, here the opportunities are to work on gender and social inclusion, incorporate that into the policy and legal framework, make sure that the institutions and the way institutions are developed to target different actions and different beneficiaries and different problem solving, that incorporates gender equality and social inclusion, and also how those can address the underlying barriers to building inclusion, to building equality, and incorporating that into the way those are constructed and the way that therefore IWRM is used as part of building the trajectories for inclusive growth. And just to draw then across the 6 pillars from the enabling environment through the institutions into the problem solving, and make sure it's part of that as well. So last and final slide. So to conclude, IWRM continues to be a cornerstone of building water security, but it needs to be made more operational, to go from the cathedral into the bazaar. We have the means of doing that by introducing these practical pillars with a really problem-solving focus. As we do that, we help to align these competing narratives for water management, what can be perceived as competing narratives, and we help align water management and IWRM as a guiding framework for water solutions across other aspects of the 2030 agenda. But we need that practical problem-solving lens in order to help with that alignment. Making IWRM more practical, more operational means, as I said, thinking of it much more as the high-level, overarching, basic framework under which you can do a diversity of things to solve problems. So the second point, within that, being pragmatic in the approaches to problem solving in ways that complement that strategy setting and address stakeholder priorities. Thinking about the operating mechanisms, which don't have to be hardwired as institutions, but enable different sectors and actors to come together and solve problems practically. And then the fourth point, which I haven't really talked about so much, but of course, next to that needs to be the monitoring and the measurements to enable accountability, etc. So let me finish there and hand back to Ravi, and I hope that's been good food for thought. Thank you.
Indeed, Mark, it's been more than food for thought. It's been a very rich fair. Thank you very, very much. This is complex, but fascinating. I'm going to throw it open for questions from the floor. But before I do that, can I slip in a couple of my own?
Certainly.
Mark, one
Shall
thing.
I stop sharing? I'll stop sharing.
Yeah. So you talked about food systems, climate change, and inclusive growth. Now, we know that the Asia-Pacific region is a bazaar, but a very noisy bazaar with all sorts of conflicting and, conflicting agendas, et cetera, et cetera. So a little bit about the trade-offs. In other words, if we do the 6-prong approach for food systems, separately for climate change, and separately for inclusive growth, do we not risk clashes and dissonance? That's just a very broad question in the context of a very diverse region.
Yeah, in a way, Ravi, I think that's kind of the point, and that's where I think the original 4 pillars they haven't gone far enough, and that's why we, in the work that I did with Torkel and our other collaborators, That's what was challenging us. Exactly that. Because the reality of the world in which IWRM seeks to operate is as you described it, right? That's the reality of that environment. So the original 4 pillars, with that kind of top-down nature, the way that tended to play out, or tends to play out sometimes, is indeed that the cross-sectoral integration and the cross-sectoral trade-offs and the difficulties that there are at multiple levels in handling those get submerged, and as a result, progress isn't as rich as it could be and should be. And so the 5th and 6th pillars that I introduced, what they're doing is creating a means for negotiation, a means for dialogue and debate, so that the different sectors, the different actors can indeed come together and say, you know, we've got trade-offs that we have to work on. And I put that rather informally, but that can happen at policy level. It can happen at local problem-solving level. To do that well, yes, they need the institutional structures. Yes, they need the data. They need the information to help them have those negotiations more effectively. But also, let's recognize, and this is what Elinor Ostrom's work is grounded in, is the way I've understood it. Let's recognize that in doing that, in approaching those trade-offs, you never have perfect information. It's just the nature of these systems. You never have perfect information. So there's always some level of uncertainty. So there's always a need for negotiation and dialogue. So the means to manage and handle those trade-offs, I would argue, is incorporated by giving IWRM these additional pillars that make it more practically and problem-solving and operationally oriented.
Thank you, Mark. So I suppose in the science policy intersection, science is never perfect, as we keep, and so you got to keep reinventing the solutions as you keep going along. And that requires a high degree of trust and, I suppose, dialogue, isn't it? You don't shout at each other, you talk to each other. And that kind of capacity has to be built in the institutions of governance all over the place, and including people themselves.
And including science institutions. So science, in this context of changing complex systems with their inherent unknowns and uncertainties, science is a service, right? Science is a service to help people resolve those complexities. And it's a service to help build solutions. In this kind of complex environment, it's not like building a new smartphone where you can take technologies and build it. With water management, it just doesn't work like that. So science has to be a service to help that broader community of actors do a better job.
Thank you, Mark. So we've got to be humble about this. We can't. I mean, attitude is as important as ability.
I absolutely advocate that. Yes.
Okay, good. So now, Yumiko, will you be able to introduce 1 or 2 more questions from either the Q&A or the chat box for Dr. Smith?
Okay. So firstly, I would like to ask the question from the Q&A box. Firstly, I would like to ask Mr. Colin Heron, could you raise your question more specifically based on your Q&A box? Thank you.
I'm sorry, could you just repeat that?
Colin.
Yes, Mr. Colin.
Okay.
Colin, over to you. Please ask.
Oh, sorry, I got it. Sorry. Well, I can, perhaps Colin's having difficulty with his mute or something, but I can read the question. And Colin's question is, the 6-point definition of IWRM is very interesting, yet SDG 6.5.1 only refers to the first four, i.e. the standard definition. Was there any attempt made to introduce the two additional dimensions of IWRM, and if so, what happened next? Short answer is no. I suppose our little team was having our debates and dialogues in parallel with that much bigger team working on the SDG indicator development. But I agree, it's an interesting dimension of the challenge of how to track IWRM implementation, because clearly, and this is indeed part of the critique, you could, if we remember back to that map of IWRM implementation, you can have countries in green that are doing really well against those four measures, but they're not doing a good job of delivering solutions on the ground in practical and operational ways. So it would be interesting to have those measures as well. Although now that I think of it, we did have, of course, that the 651 data is collated by the UNEP DHI Center, and we did have some discussions with them about some of this as well. Yeah.
Thank you. Can I also ask Mr. Motarab Hossain, Mr. Sakar, who is raising question? Mr. Sakar, floor is for yours.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you very much for a nice presentation. I have one questions and some remarks. Number one, Mr. Smith mentioned about the order for the food systems. So order for food system means it is a rigorous, but I like to tell you about the water use efficiency for the production of the crops. So this is very important issues for South Asian countries, especially for Bangladesh. Still, we are struggling with the irrigation water use efficiency, 38% or 35%, something like that. But we need to increase that on more than 50% or 50 to 60%. So we need to address this issue. In the further, the climate change issue also aggravating on this issue. So how we can increase our water use efficiency in this region to develop some sort of water use framework. So is it possible to share what type of framework using by different countries in the South Asian regions? Then it will be nice for us to know, and then we can try our, we can maybe pilot it, we can maybe implement those framework in our country to increase water efficiency. Because you know that Bangladesh is a land-hungry country, and the population is increasing, land is decreasing, but we need the water productivity. We need to increase the water productivity as well as the agricultural productivity. So in that case, we have to compromise with the water use efficiency. What I mean that we have to increase the water efficiency in every aspect. So is there any suggestion from you? Thank you very much.
Great question, thank you. And I think increasing water productivity is a great example of the kind of high priority, and in some countries extremely high priority, but yet very practical problems where the change needed to bring about what's needed to bring about real change in water productivity and the way water is used needs to happen at the ground. And so it's a good example to think through how we can and should be applying those 6 pillars, where I would argue in order to tackle that, you most certainly need the first 4. So you need the right policy framework and institutions. You need data to know where to target your interventions, for example, and you need to know where to target your investments. But that alone will not be sufficient. That alone will not drive real changes, real gains in water productivity. the gains in water productivity, that's a complex, it's a complex challenge. It plays out, the changes needed play out at a range of different scales, from the field, from the plot up to the basin, and in some framings beyond, and the interactions between those scales. So it's a complex problem, and those original 4 pillars of IWRM, they alone, they can't solve it. So the 5th and 6th then introduce new elements, which can then be problem focused, stakeholder focused. This idea of operating mechanisms. If you've got to work on water productivity in Bangladesh or in a particular setting, who are the actors? Who are the sectors that are motivated, that need to change, etc. Come together based upon those, with the foundation of those first 4 pillars, then come together with complex change management strategies and approaches under the 5th pillar, mobilized with alongside learning and capacity development, etc. And then what are the operating mechanisms that can drive the needed actors through collective action to make the real change happen. And then what I think, just to finish, alongside that, I don't know, it may be true in parts of Bangladesh, but it's certainly true in some parts of the world, where as we go forward and further into the 21st century under climate change and so on, and the pressures on the resource are such that we're going to have to find ways of cutting water use in agriculture, not just making it more productive, but cutting it, which is a hugely complex challenge. But I believe this very practically oriented approach to operationalizing IWRM can help us figuring out how to do that on the ground. Thank you.
Thank you. Can I ask one more question? This is a very important question. He's asking how to incorporate the 6th pillar of the IWRM for groundwater resource management. Thank you, Mark.
Yeah, thank you for that question. My belief would be that all 6 apply also to groundwater management, right? The critical architecture for groundwater management, the right policies, the right laws. We need specificity about groundwater management and groundwater and its particular characteristics. You need the right kind of institutions. Those needs to be local through to national and aquifer level and so on. You need data. That's as an invisible resource. You need data and measurement to know what's going on, and then to be able to incorporate that into your decisions. You need to be able to make the right kinds of investments, recognizing that groundwater itself and the aquifers themselves are infrastructure. So investing in that infrastructure. And then when you have real problems, depletion of groundwater, or, over extraction and depletion of groundwater, pollution of groundwater, what are the changes that are needed in that institutional and operational setup to bring about solutions? So incorporating the change management elements and the learning elements. And then in doing that, who are the key actors? Who are the key actors and the key sectors intersecting with the groundwater resource that need to be part of the solution? And you could imagine, I mean, I had that slide with the umbrella and the operating mechanisms. So you might have an operating mechanism under that overarching framework that you could, for particular places that you could describe for groundwater management, I would say. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Now I would like to ask Ravi for wrap up of today's webinar.
Thank you, Yumiko. Thank you very much, Mark. That's fascinating. I'm sure there are lots more questions, but those of you who have more questions, please don't despair. You can send in your written questions to Yumiko, and she will request Mark and his team to try and address some of them, if not all of them. Now, this has been a fascinating webinar because It deals with complexity with a very big C: food systems, climate change, adaptation, and inclusive growth. Because there are many moving parts and nothing is absolutely fixed for all time. Recommendations for the Asia Pacific Water Summit, which is what this system of what this program of webinars is going to be all about, is going to be difficult and challenging. But I'm sure we can draw on some principles that can be recommended to the political heads of the governments of our Asia Pacific region, so that the situation can move from despair to hope and from the downside to the upside. So thank you very, very much, Mark. We are very indebted to you. And thank you also for bringing out the issues of complexity and non-certainty about some of these, and the question of adapting to the situation in hand. I think that's very important. So no magic bullets here. It's dialogue, discussion, bargaining, and discussions. So with that, I'd like to thank all of you for participating. I'd like to give Mark a very, very big hand. Thank you.
Thank you. No, I've enjoyed the session. I hope people have found it useful. Thank you.
Okay, Yumiko.
Yes.
We close now, and you can announce the thing for the future.
Yes, thank you so much. Thank you so much for Ravi for facilitating this webinar. And also thank you so much for Dr. Mark Smith providing very, very useful presentation to us. So we will definitely incorporate your message towards the 4th Asia Pacific Water Summit. Thank you so much for your cooperation and collaboration for the summit. Now, I would like to introduce the next webinar. The next APWF webinar will be organized in 12th March, and we will have a speaker from UN Habitat introduce the case study from our region, from India, Myanmar, Fiji, Laos, and so on. They are discussing the issue of WASH as an entry point to reduce COVID-19 vulnerabilities and other hazards. So the registration URL will be informed to you by email, and this information will be also introduced on our website. So please keep communication with us toward the next APWF webinar and also our for Asia Pacific Water Summit. Thank you. And lastly, our today's presentation documents and also the recording will be also available from the APWF website. Please access and also introduce our webinar series to your colleague and network. Thank you so much.